Today, we're taking a gander at a good old vintage murder mystery, a seemingly random attack on a taxi driver. And the weapon of choice? A cheese wire of all things. 2 witnesses in more than 4 decades of baffling dead ends, only this might just be one of the few cold cases that actually gets solved. Just this last year, police dropped a bombshell. There was something at the scene that they never disclosed in '83. Here's the story of George Murdoch, one of Scotland's most notorious unsolved murders. Grab a plate of haggis, a splash of some good scotch on the rocks, and get comfy. We're headed to 1983. Let's get into it. George Murdoch was born and raised in Aberdeen, the northeast of Scotland, where the building and the cobblestones might be gray and cold, but the hearts and the humor of the Northerners are warm and fresh. Everyone just called him Dodd, including his wife of 37 years, Jessie. The couple didn't have any children, but they were blissfully happy. When their nieces and nephews and extended family talk about their aunt and uncle, they sound so dang sweet and in love that it makes me rethink all of my past relationships. Just a pair of lovebirds who like to fish, boat, and tend to George's beloved pigeons. Sadly, George's steady job at the factory was made redundant sometime in the 70s, causing a bit of a rough patch for the pair. So George took up taxi driving to make ends meet. Jessie fretted and worried herself to death over her husband's late shifts and the fact that he regularly had to drive into the bad parts of the harbor city, where the sailors, gangs, and ladies of the night skulked in alleyways. George assured Jessie that if he were ever robbed, he wouldn't be dumb enough to put up a fight. He'd hand over the money and even his Ford Cortina if the scoundrel wanted, but he'd return to her every night come hell or high water. The 19th of September 1983 was a busy Thursday for George. Thursday's the expected shopping day for the wives before the weekend and the working men who had late shifts or incoming shipments from the harbor. So the morning started early and the 58-year-old expected to be home after it got dark. At around 8 that evening, George was just about to end his long day and took his final round of his assigned area looking for some last stragglers who needed a ride before 9. He radioed into the control room at 8:30 to log in that he was headed to Cutler with a customer located in the western outskirts of Aberdeen for his next fare. Witnesses reported that the customer was a young man in his late 20s to early 30s, slim, dark-haired, and with a pale complexion. He flagged down George's taxi on Queens Road, got in, and everything about the event was as normal as any other transaction between customer and driver. The fact that he was a stranger wasn't unusual, especially not in that part of town. This is a major port city in Scotland, and unfamiliar men are as commonplace as the taxis themselves. George drove the 3 kilometers to Pitfoddle Station Road on the west side of town. That's 2 miles in freedom units for us Americans who drive on the wrong side of the world. Or should I say, the right side of the road. If you recall, George had called in to let the control room know that he was taking the customer to the district of Cutler, but Pitfoddle Station Road, where he stopped, was not in Cutler. Apparently, the dark-haired young man had told him to stop a little earlier. Pitfoddle's Road was the perfect place for what the stranger was about to do, however. Residential, quiet, and practically sleepy compared to the rest of the busy city. It was dimly lit, and all the families who lived there had already turned in for the night, all except for 2 teenage boys who were out riding their bikes past their curfew. They saw the taxi ride past, stop on the side of the road, and before George could even turn around to collect his fare, the man in the back seat threw something around George's neck and started to strangle him. After several minutes, George somehow managed to get what we now know to be a cheese wire off his neck and stumbled out of the car. But the young man jumped on top of George again and continued to strangle him on the ground. It only took a few seconds for George to stop moving. The man then proceeded to take George's wallet from his pants pocket and fled into the night. The boys, who'd managed to remain out of sight, ran for the nearest house the moment the attacker was out of the way to call the police. A police dog handler named Percy Allen Henry, who happened to be nearby, heard the call go out on his radio, and he was the first person to arrive at the scene. George still had a pulse, but barely. He died just as the first police car pulled up and Percy Henry held his hand until the ambulance arrived, so at least he didn't die alone. Since Percy and his dog were there, the investigators sent him and his tracker canine out to look for a scent, but they had a strange way of going about it. They sent Percy 4 kilometers down the road at the railway station and told Percy to walk back toward the murder scene from there. Percy couldn't understand why they'd focused on the railway tracks first when there was a large wooded area that the murderer would have been more likely to have gone through. Naturally, Percy's canine found no scent on the tracks that matched what was on the car. It didn't help that it was a wet, rainy night either. Percy did go back the next morning to search the wooded area himself, just because it bugged him all night that it wasn't searched. All he found was a man-made den of sorts where someone had slept. It's unlikely that the killer hunkered down there for the night since it was so close to the murder scene. It was most likely a homeless individual, but it goes to show you that there might have been a witness that police allowed to slip through their fingers. As for the scene, let's start with the body. George had some serious lacerations around his neck thanks to that cheese wire, but that wasn't what killed him. He suffered a head wound during the second part of the struggle, possibly caused by the attacker grabbing his head and banging it against a hard road. It's unclear if he died due to the head wound, strangulation, or if the event caused a cardiac episode. Scottish police, and all of Britain for that matter, are very skint on information on open cases. All of the details we now know were never officially released. This all comes from family and friends of George or law enforcement that were willing to sit down to talk to reporters after they retired. There were no fingerprints or any other physical evidence except for the cheese wire, and it was determined that George had only 21 quid in his wallet. Though it's not certain that robbery was the motive here. I mean, who goes out and just happens to have a cheese wire in their pocket? It's not exactly the most effective weapon to use in a robbery. A knife or a gun would give you more space between the robber and the victim. Besides, robbery is one thing. There's no reason to kill anyone once you've got the money, now is there? The risk of getting in so close for a few bucks is enormous, unless the murder was the intended outcome all along. George wasn't young, but he wasn't small and weak either. The killer had to have known that an attack with this kind of weapon was going to be intimately close and violent. The theory has long since been that this young man went out that night intending to kill someone. Strangulation, when utilized in random stranger killings, are almost always exacted by predators, serial killers, and planned killings. Taking the wallet was most likely a misdirection or a second thought. A few blocks away from the scene, a couple saw a man matching the description running in the direction of Aberdeen city center. They added that he was about 5'6" and that he was clean-shaven and well-groomed, but his hair was over his ears, not long like someone who wore their hair long, more like he was due for a haircut. Another man also saw him running by, heading in the same direction that the couple described. 3 weeks later, a chip shop owner came forward with a strange sighting on the night of the murder. Naturally, the news of the gruesome, seemingly random murder had spread all over Scotland by now, and since not everyone had TVs, it took the owner a while to put the pieces together. His shop was located 1.5 kilometers away from the crime scene. That's 1 mile for the Americans. Sorry, we're working with the British metric system here, and since we decided to veer off to the wrong side of the road a gazillion years ago, I'll remind us all when distances come up again. Anyway, that night, around 9 in the evening, approximately 15 minutes after the murder and 10 minutes after the 3 witnesses had seen the running man, an older man with dark hair came in to order some fish and chips. He'd obviously been in a fight just before coming in and sported a blooming black eye, bloody hands, and scratches on his nose and cheek. He was friendly, asked for some band-aids, and finished his meal without any drama. Police believed that this was most likely just a bar brawl or a fight with the missus, because it seemed unlikely that a murderer would fancy a chippy just 15 minutes after killing someone. He'd almost certainly want to stay out of sight and get cleaned up afterwards, as all of his actions indicated in the 15 minutes prior. And this man was on the older side, thought to be in his 50s. Regardless of the inconsistencies, they did their due diligence anyway and attempted to identify this man. but they came up with nothing. But this did bring up the fact that the killer would definitely have wounds on his hands. Cheese wires are wicked sharp, and they almost always cause cuts during attacks of this nature. Heck, it can sever a finger easily if they're caught up in a loop during a strangulation attempt. This led police to station teams at the harbors and various industries around the coastline, where almost all of the thousands of outsiders came in for stops. Since no one recognized the suspect, the likelihood was that he'd be one of these passerbys. But if you know anything about fishing vessels and oil rigs, yeah, this wasn't the best plan. Those were all hardworking men, and they all had fresh injuries on their forearms and hands from their everyday working conditions. But that's not to say that the Scottish police didn't do their part. George's murder is still one of the biggest manhunts in Scotland's history. They stopped at 10,000 houses, questioned thousands with violent records, and took around 8,000 statements from tips. For the next few decades, George's murder hung in the air like a dark cloud over his family. Jessie was absolutely shattered. She became a recluse, refusing to leave her home unaccompanied for fear that her husband's killer would return because the wallet that contained their address was never found. George's favorite nephew, Alex McKay, said that she just never recovered from the trauma, and neither did the rest of the family. Jessie died of natural causes in 2004 at the age of 64, never knowing who took her beloved Dodd's life. In 2022, police dropped a bombshell. They were looking for a man wearing an Iron Maiden t-shirt that frequented Wilson's Sports Bar in Aberdeen in 2015. He was said to be a local in his late 60s or 70s, and his build was on the shorter, stockier side. They raised the reward money to £20,000, firmly believing that there was a family member or an old pub buddy out there somewhere who knew or suspected something sinister about the killer. A year later, they revealed that they'd isolated a DNA sample from the original crime scene that gave them a perfect profile of a Caucasian male. So there was more to the crime scene that wasn't revealed back then after all. This complete sample allowed investigators to perform familial DNA searching, identifying 200 possible genetic matches. In other words, 200 people out there who may be related to the killer. In the 2 years since that statement, they've been combing through the 200 matches. But like I said, the British investigative regulations are a whole lot different than most cases we cover. They won't come out with any more information unless it's absolutely necessary or if they made an arrest. These decades-old cases are almost never solved, and no one really has any hope of finding answers after such a long time. But I don't think that'll be the case with George's murder. I just have a sneaky feeling that the police have more evidence than they're letting on. That, coupled with the news that they have a good DNA sample to work with, well, this could very well be one of those miracles that the cold case files so desperately needs. George still has a family out there who need answers. His nieces and nephews, who adored their favorite uncle, are deeply invested in finding their Uncle Dodd's murderer. Not to mention a country that still remembers how deeply disturbed they were to hear about the local Joe, whom they all knew and worked with, who was so gruesomely killed out of nowhere. Right out on the street where their children rode their bikes. If this case ever gets solved, there are a lot of people out there who'll be bringing out the good bottle to give old Dodd one final cheer. Here's hoping that George and Jessie get the justice they deserve soon. If there's any movement in the case, I'll be sure to catch you guys up. Have a good one, people. See you in the next one. Cheers.